Good morning.
Good
I
morning.
think we're on. It's May 16th, 10 a.m. Mountain Time. Good morning.
This is
Go ahead.
Bibles and Bagels with the Beals.
Bagels.
Bibles. Of any kind.
And the Beals. And we love to see who's here. So just make sure you know. I know they're coming, but a lot of people don't. Oh, good. I like it because I'm an extrovert, so I really like to see that there are people there. Otherwise, it's just you and me. It's always you and me.
Welcome to quarantine.
Quarantine with the Beals.
Right.
Some people do much more interesting things, but we do the Bible, so we gotta bring to the table what we can do.
We just finished Westworld last night.
Ooh, we
the
did.
Third season.
Have any of you watched Westworld? 3 seasons in 2 weeks.
Yeah, or less.
It's intense.
It was intense.
It was intense. So I watched 50% of it with my eyes closed. How are you doing?
Pretty okay.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Third session.
Yeah, so this is our third and final for this little mini series that we decided to try out. And we're talking about, some folks have said, maybe it'd be great to do more of this kind of thing. So we might look for another theme, another biblical focus of some kind, or even maybe something else, but do another mini series at some point. I think that's what we're thinking about. Be open to ideas if anybody wanted to suggest anything, but we have some of our own too. Yeah.
If you are interested in doing this again of something, maybe you can wave at some point in this, and then it'll be like raising your hands that you would do something else with the Beals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or not. I don't know.
Yeah. Please stop.
Please, no more Bagels and Bibles with you. No, we've had a great time. This has been really fun.
Yeah.
So we're glad to do this. Mm-hmm. So again, here we are doing Psalms for a time of pandemic. We thought this would be really relevant, and I think people have found reading the Psalms helpful and informative to the mental health of and the mental state that we all are in. Especially, we have focused on the phase, the time of disorientation. As you recall, we've been using Walter Brueggemann's, biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann's schema or framework of reading the Psalms, classifying them or putting them into 3 categories. One being Psalms of orientation, times in life when things feel stable and centered and more normal, easier to say God is blessing and
everything makes sense.
It's stability, which I'm appreciating more and more right now in times of instability. And then moving into those times in our lives where maybe out of nowhere a crisis comes, or a time of destabilization and feeling like the center has moved and we're not sure where we are oriented any longer. And those times of disorientation, and we would say the pandemic in this time is that kind of time in our lives, and we're trying to figure out where we are, and we don't know. We literally don't know how long this will last, and so it's disorienting. And then the third piece of that framework, the third phase, movement. Yeah, movement's better. The third movement is new orientation. Remember, that's not reorientation. There's no sense of going back. There's no return. There is a newness that will come once one is through disorientation, and new life and transformation and difference will happen. So we're working with that framework. And before we begin, I think it's appropriate again to begin our time of respect with the text. I'm going to use just a brief piece of a prayer from Walter Brueggemann. The book is Ode to Heaven, Rooted in Earth. We strongly recommend this book of prayers. He's an incredible prayer, and his use of language is poetic, to say the least. So let us begin with a word of illumination. Listen this day for the groans and yearnings of your world. Listen to our own songs of joy and our own drudges of death. And in the midst of our stammering, speak your clear word of life. In the name of your word, come flesh. Amen. All right.
Good. Well, so I think we'll kind of do pretty something quite similar to what we did last time in terms of just a brief additional overview about Hebrew biblical poetry and the Psalms and how we might engage them and read them together. I'll be even more cursory this time than I was last time, kind of iterating but simplifying each time. But you could go back to the earlier videos in the beginning if you wanted to get a little more introductory sense or read some of Walter Brueggemann's books on the Psalms or other things like that. So first, just a little bit about Hebrew biblical poetry. Remember that all of the Old Testament Hebrew scriptures are in Hebrew, written in the Hebrew language. And poetry, you've got poetry and you've got narrative in the Old Testament. Poetry is where all of the sort of, feelings and experiences are delved into in depth and in great intensity. When you're reading narrative, there's almost no window onto the feelings and inner experiences or even thoughts of the characters in these narratives. But when you move to poetry, all of that just sort of breaks open. So very, very expressive language, and that language is often very much embodied. It's about the metaphors and the figures and the terms that are used are rooted in the physical senses, in the aesthetic experience, embodied experience. So body parts and feelings and taste and eyes and tongues and ears and sounds, all of that are central in this poetic language. So you'll notice that again today as we dive in. The other thing that's just is something to keep in mind, because it's a little bit unusual for us, it's not something that we see in modern poetry or really in any English poetry, and that is something called parallelism. And basically what you have with parallelism is you've got a division of lines into parts, and usually 2 or 3 parts, and of roughly equal length, and then they have they're very synonymous with one another usually, so they parallel each other. So it feels like really repetitive to us when we're reading it. Sometimes those parallelisms are what we call synonymous parallelism, where each word corresponds in the next line with a synonym, and we have great examples of that in the Psalms today. And in other cases they are called antithetical parallelism, such as every valley, every low place will be lifted up, and every high place will be brought low. That's antithetical. You can see how it's inverted, but it's parallel and matches word for word. That very first couple of verses in Psalm 29, which we're going to get to in detail later, is a good example of synonymous parallelism. Ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength, ascribe to the Lord the glory of his name. And then you've got a break from the parallelism with the second half of verse 2, worship the Lord in holy splendor. So 3 imperatives with synonymous kinds of statements following them. So that's parallelism, and watch for that. Just a little bit about the Psalms. This is a collection of 150 poems, all in Hebrew. The context for these was the religious life of ancient Israel and ancient Judah. Worship, other kinds of rituals. We might see this Psalm 29 as an enthronement psalm, a psalm that would have been used during a kind of annual ritual, perhaps, in which God is essentially being enthroned, being described as being enthroned, and it might have gone along with the enthronement of a king or who knows what. But these are coming out of the collective shared religious life of ancient Israel. They would have been sung, they would have been performed in a way orally and canted, sung aloud in a kind of rhythmic, melodic way. So that's just a little bit about the Psalms to keep in mind as we look at them. These were collected over many centuries. They represent lots of different historical contexts and situations. They were eventually collected together probably into smaller collections, and then eventually into the larger collection that we now have of these 150 psalms. There certainly were other ones, and in fact there's a great psalm of new orientation in the middle of the book of Jonah. When Jonah is in the fish, when he's been swallowed by the fish. That's the book
of Jonah.
Yeah. What did I say?
That's right.
Okay. In the book of
Jonah in Jonah.
Yes. So when Jonah is in the whale, in the whatever it is, big fish, Jonah sings a psalm of new orientation. Talks about how he was in the chaos and he cried out and God delivered him, and somehow that
he's
song,
still in it.
Yeah, well he's in it, and then somehow that provokes the fish to spit him up. So it has this sort of interesting effect. But that's another psalm. It's not in the book of Psalms, but it is elsewhere in the Hebrew scriptures. So they're all over the place. Anyway, so we're going to get into, do you want to say anything more? You already talked about orientation, disorientation.
I did.
New orientation. Anything further about?
No.
Okay.
I think it's good. About the Psalms, as Tim was saying, that they're recited probably were recited in the community. I think of them as the book of prayers, the book of common worship in many ways. This is the liturgy that the people use, and it gives us the spectrum of human emotion, and so we turn to them for prayer.
Right. And one thing that we might also want to mention is that there's an audacity to them that is unfamiliar, I think, to most of us in our own religious lives, that believes that the voice of suffering, the voice of pain, the voice of disorientation can move God to act when God was not acting. And, related to that, we'll see some language in them today. Remember, do not forget, which suggests that there is a sort of experience of divine absence that wonders whether God has forgotten and needs to remember, and that this imperative to remember is to remember because you seem to have forgotten us, because you have forgotten us, right. Not just seen.
Right.
And this is deep in ancient Israelite faith, this notion that the voice of pain, the experience of pain, moves God to act. It's also core, we should say, we should add to what we know as liberation theology. Liberation theology that believes that God takes the side of the poor and the oppressed over against the powers that be. That God has a preferential treatment for those who are suffering. And
so these stories and these narratives about liberation were used and informed many of the civil rights movements and liberations movements on the globe, around the globe. The civil rights movement, particularly, that Martin Luther King Jr. turned often to those stories.
Yeah, you can even see something like blues music as being, inspired in some ways by that same honoring and making space for the voice of suffering.
Right.
Yeah. So when we're reading these, this is kind of our method here, fairly simple, and that's part of what I love about this method. Anyone can participate in it. Everyone can see things, and as we do, then we start to get a better feel for the craft of this particular poem that we're looking at. And so we try to stay really literal. We stick with the literal details and don't jump to kind of big theological questions to start, but stay with those concrete details, those words. And in particular, we look for repetitions. So we'll read it and then we'll start by what are some of the repetitions that we see. Words that are literally repeated, images or kinds of images that are pervasive. For example, water images or something like that. Look at the verbs that are repeated, and also look at the forms of the verbs, imperative verbs, where it's commanding someone to do something. The psalmist usually commanding God to do something, versus imperfect verbs, you will or I will, and plural versus singular, first person plural, we, first person singular, I, and that. Pay attention to those little things. Particles like therefore or because can be very important. Or yet. Yeah. So watch for those as we move through too. Stay super literal like that, and I'll show you again. This is what mine looks like today. I just got up early and was going through it, but you can see I've circled words that I'm finding repeated and then connected them together and drawn lines between them and made squares around some and circles around some and double underlines around others. Yes.
I've done the same. See?
Very good.
Yep. You work with the text.
Yep.
You got to print it out and work with it. Don't be afraid to get messy. That's right.
That's exactly right. And you start to see a structure and a shape as you do that. And so that's our method, that's our approach, and then we kind of go from there. What does that shape suggest, and what kinds of questions emerge out of the poem as we begin to see it in this way. So we are going to do 2 psalms today. That one is a collective psalm of disorientation, spoken from the collective people to God, and I'll say a little more about it. But in a crisis time when presumably the Babylonians have overtaken Jerusalem and have destroyed the temple and also other worship places, around the land. And then Psalm 29, our second psalm, is a psalm of new orientation. So we thought it'd be good to end with something like that, with a little uplift, and see how that interacts with disorientation.
Tim wanted to only do disorientation psalms.
No, I wanted to only do new orientation psalms.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
I thought you said you wanted to do a collective.
Disorientation, the new orientation.
Oh, I misunderstood you.
Matter.
I thought I was the one that wanted to end with new orientation.
So we both did.
Yeah, good.
It's all good.
I'm going to talk more.
These 2 psalms have something in common, which is that they have to do with the relationship between God and chaos, or the forces of chaos and disorientation, and oftentimes personified as waters or the deep, or even monstrous figures who represent chaos. And sometimes God is against those forces, and sometimes God seems to sort of be those forces in different ways. And so that'll be part of what we'll be talking about today. So we're going to start with 74, and again, kind of model a discussion of that, go fairly quickly, and then focus together as much as we can do that with the little comments on Psalm 29, which is shorter, a little more doable in this short space.
Okay.
So do you want to...
74?
Yeah.
I'll read 74.
And remember that what is being described here, the context for this is that the Babylonians have overtaken Jerusalem and have destroyed the temple. So this is in the early 500s BCE, at the beginning, after which you had the Babylonian exile. Mount Zion is a reference to Jerusalem, and to keep that in mind too.
So the center of the life of the community has been destroyed, and so they are in true disorientation because their identity and the center where God resides is gone.
Right.
O God, why do you cast us off forever? Why does your anger smoke against the sheep of your pasture? Remember your congregation which you acquired long ago, which you redeemed to be the tribe of your heritage. Remember Mount Zion where you came to dwell. Direct your steps to the perpetual ruins. The enemy has destroyed everything in the sanctuary. Your foes have roared within your holy place. They set up their emblems there. At the upper entrance they hacked the wooden trellis with axes, and then with hatchets and hammers they smashed all its carved work. They set your sanctuary on fire. They desecrated the dwelling place of your name, bringing it to the ground. They said to themselves, "We will utterly subdue them." They burned all the meeting places of God in the land. We do not see our emblems. There is no longer any prophet, and there is no one among us who knows how long. How long, O God, is the foe to scoff? Is the enemy to revile your name forever? Why do you hold back your hand? Why do you keep your hand hidden in your bosom? Yet God, my King, is from of old, working salvation in the earth. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the dragons in the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. You cut openings for springs and torrents. You dried up ever-flowing streams. Yours is the day, yours also the night. You established the luminaries and the sun. You have fixed all the bounds of the earth. You made summer and winter. Remember this, O Lord, how the enemy scoffs, and an impious people reviles your name. Do not deliver the soul of your dove to the wild animals. Do not forget the life of your poor forever. Have regard for your covenant, for the dark places of the land are full of the haunts of violence. Do not let the downtrodden be put to shame. Let the poor and needy praise your name. Rise up, O God, plead your cause. Remember how the impious scoff at you all day long. Do not forget the clamor of your foes, the uproar of your adversaries that goes up continually.
Thank you.
Word of the Lord.
Yeah. Happy poem.
Happy word. It's powerful.
Right. And so just sort of diving in, when I look at some of the language and also the verbs, in those first three verses have imperatives: remember, direct, and then, in fact, as we just heard, the imperative remember, along with do not forget, shows up repeatedly at the end of the poem too, in verses 18 to 23. Remember, do not deliver, do not forget, have regard, do not let the poor rise up, plead, remember, do not forget. And so you've got these imperatives to remember at the beginning of the poem, and then it comes back to them at the end. So my first thought is that this beginning and this ending are separate, are two of the key parts of the poem, and they're connected to each other. We call that an inclusio, when the poem begins and ends and kind of wraps itself up around this theme of commanding God to remember. So that's a first thing I notice. At the end of verse 3, that you've got the repetition of remember, and then you've got, although I think that second remember is implied. It is not, as I recall, in the Hebrew, but you got direct your steps to the perpetual ruins, sort of like, let's take God on a tour.
Yeah, totally.
In case you didn't
know
notice
how this went down.
And so let's walk you through it, and that moves us into that second part, which is the scene. And the subjects of the verbs here are primarily the enemies who have done all of these things to God and to the people. It's sort of both at the same time.
Well, I think it's interesting. It says the
foes.
enemy, and it's your foes.
Yes.
So it's not only an imperative. There's a bit of a hey, these are people against you. They're
right.
your enemies. So
Yes.
act.
Exactly. And your name is reviled later on. At the same time, we do not see our emblems. We will utterly subdue them. So the offense to them is the offense to God, right. And vice versa, the way this rhetoric is attempting to put God on the side of the victims here, us,
right.
Over against the enemies.
Right.
Someone was asking earlier about how sometimes this language seems like punishment. It seems like God is punishing, sometimes in the prophets, the prophet will say Babylon is an instrument of God here, punishing them for not following the law. Here the rhetoric is clearly aimed at undermining that kind of prophetic logic, saying you and we are one, you God and we are one, and any offense to us or any violence to us is a violence to you as well. So this is the scene being described here. A lot more repetition, emblems, their emblems, our emblems in verse 9. The question, how long and why, which is a repetition from up in verse 1. The scoffing, which we'll see again in that last section. A lot of repetition there. And then it turns again, if you're just paying attention to verb forms and subjects of verbs, it turns again at verse 12 to what you, God, have done in the past.
Yeah.
And this is really a kind of testimony to God who conquers chaos, conquers the forces of chaos. This is go ahead.
Yeah, I love this movement that this, in case you haven't noticed, this is what they did to your temple, our temple, and this litany of horrors. You can imagine it. It's so descriptive on how they desecrated the temple. And then in verse 12, turning to say, and in case you forgot what you're capable of doing, let us take you back a little bit. And it's Genesis 1. It's the creation story in some way. It's this is what you've done. Let us remind you of who you are and what you're capable of.
Absolutely. Yeah. Let me tell a creation story that you're the hero.
You're the hero.
Just to kind of remind you,
what you could do if you wanted to do this. You could do this.
And this is, I love that I've written about this in the past, these verses here, 12 to 17, because this is another creation story in the Bible. It echoes Genesis 1 with you've established the luminaries and the sun. Yours is the day, yours also the night. You fixed the bounds of the earth. You made summer and winter. That sounds like Genesis 1, but there are some monsters in this.
Tim wrote a book called Religion and Its Monsters a long time ago, so he's into these monsters, the monstrous.
And this was a key text because when we look at ancient Near Eastern myths, and the Bible and Israelite religion is part of the ancient Near East, we have other stories from other traditions where the Creator God, creates the world by conquering these primordial forces of chaos that were there before creation. And they are often sort of watery, chaotic, flood-like forces of the primordial deep, the waters, but they're often personified by monstrous figures whose names often even mean something like water. So here you've got dragons and you've got Leviathan. Leviathan also shows up at the end of the book of Job and in Isaiah, but Leviathan is also a figure in Canaanite religion, or at least a very closely related name. Leton is a force of chaos, a monstrous force of chaos. And so what scholars call this kind of creation story is a chaos Kampf. That's because most biblical scholars or German in the 19th century, but what that means is chaos battle. So this is a story of creation where God creates an orderly, inhabitable world by first crushing the heads of these chaotic sea monsters that were there before. It's very close to a Babylonian story called the Enuma Elish, where Marduk does this. Creates the world and creates streams out of the bodies of the monstrous Tiamat and so forth like that. So there's that story, God as superhero conquering chaos in a violent way, really.
Which we'll see in Psalm 29.
Which we'll see in Psalm 29 as well. And then that final part 4, just so much repetition of imperatives and first person singular imperfects. You will not deliver, you will not forget, have regard, let the poor and needy praise your name, rise up, plead, remember, do not forget, do not deliver, remember. Just incredible repetition there as well. And so that we start to get that kind of shape of the poem then through that. It starts with imperatives. It then goes to look what's happening now. It then goes, as you said, to look what you did last time or another time when the forces of chaos were, opening up a can of whoop ass on the on the world or on the people, and do that again, please.
Yes,
that's sort of the structure.
Yeah, and the end, the 20 through 23. Well, 20. I can't see that. 18 through 23. I mean, there are imperative, and there's also a desperation in that imperative. Can be the voice of desperation, like remember this and do not forget. And then this the appeal for the needy and the poor and the downtrodden, like these are the ones that you care about. Turn and look at us. Don't hide your face from us. Cast us off.
Something to think about there, just in terms of our present context. We know that that this pandemic and this crisis, this chaos, this disorientation is disproportionately affecting those who are poor and marginalized,
already downtrodden,
already victims of racism and classism, and they are also disproportionately affected by this chaos as well.
Right, and there's no answer for that, and we sit with that tension because there's no resolve, right? That's the truth, and you can't rescue God from that.
Right.
Okay.
Happy days.
That's disorientation. Yeah. Okay.
I think it's amazing that a poem like this, got in some ways.
Yeah.
It's remarkable in its theology. It's telling a different creation story that doesn't match Genesis 1 or Genesis 2 or Job 38 or Psalm 104. It's a different kind of creation story that's there too, which says something about the way this biblical canon was put together. There's a comfort level with there is an embrace of polyvocality of difference. Here's one story of creation, now here's another, They don't have to match, they don't have to sync up. It's not a kind of an empirical description of the origins of the world or something like that. These are stories, they're poetic imaginings.
Well, that's probably a new way to think for many of us, that there are more than the first two chapters of Genesis for creation stories, and to tease these out, we don't hear about that. One of the things that struck me as I was reading this text this morning, I thought to read these, and especially to read them out loud, I think there's a real power in reading this language out loud, these kind of cries to God, and the imperatives in asking God and insisting that God respond. We don't pray like that. We don't pray like that in church, for sure. And so to go back to the Psalms, we are given this language, and we don't have to apologize because we're reading the scripture. This is the scripture, and this is the language we've been given, and that we can be, we just can be more confident, more bold, and more candid about our emotions. And it's right here for us. It does the work for us.
I was just noticing one more thing that I hadn't noticed before, which is the way in which the actions of the enemies against the temple parallel the actions of God against the monstrous forces of chaos. They smashed all of the carved work and tear down and cut up, and God crushes the heads of Leviathan and broke the heads of the dragons, and
So it's
so
almost this parallel.
they're powerful,
there.
but
Yeah.
you were even more powerful.
Oh, that's
in
good.
this other
That's
story.
good. They did
Yeah.
this, but you can,
Mhm.
you've done this.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's interesting. So as a pastoral piece of this too, from a pastoral perspective, this made me think because of this psalm being emerging from the destruction of the temple and the center of Israelite life, the communal life. I thought about the pastoral connection of what do we do when the center of our lives are moved, when the center is moved from our lives, and what does that look like for you personally when a crisis has come and you feel like the center is moved, and what was that in your life, and how do you respond, and what in your life have you responded to in that way when what you have oriented yourself around, a marriage maybe that has ended, or a death of someone, and literally reorienting your life to something else, a new orientation.
Yeah.
That's my word.
I appreciate it. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Just thinking about it.
So, we move to new orientation?
Yeah, let's.
Or do you
let's
want to
do
keep
that.
to it?
No. I
Okay.
think we've got just about the right amount of time to focus on that. So let's do that. And this is a psalm of new orientation. Again, oftentimes psalms of new orientation, like what we looked at on the first session, I think Psalm 13 it was, we'll even sometimes remember their disorientation before talking about how they cried out and were delivered. This one does not include a narrative of what it was like being in disorientation.
Right, that's right.
But it is all about God's control over, and even I would suggest identification with, very chaotic forces and powers. So do you want to read it? Do you want me to read it and you start first talking about it, or how about I read it and you dive in, or would you rather the other way around?
We're usually not this polite.
No, you.
No, you first. Mm-hmm. I'll read it.
Okay.
Okay. And let me say, this Psalm 29, almost 30 years ago, I preached on this psalm for my senior sermon in seminary. I don't know why I chose this psalm as my senior sermon.
I think I do.
What?
You were pregnant and had been sick and disoriented, and you
Right.
talked about that.
Yeah,
I
did. I still am
Noah's
surprised
Ark.
I chose this psalm, but yeah, You're right. I was super sick in my pregnancy with our daughter, and so something resonated about the Lord sits enthroned over the chaos, which I guess that's how I felt. Anyway, so this psalm means a lot to me.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is called an enthronement psalm. As Tim said, there's a Canaanite, this was part of the Canaanite mythology. I read that it was maybe one of the oldest psalms in the psalm, the psalmody. And anyway, ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory of his name. Worship the Lord in holy splendor. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders, the Lord over mighty waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The Lord breaks the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon skip like a calf, and Syrian like a young wild ox. The voice of the Lord flashes forth flames of fire. The voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness. The Lord shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. The voice of the Lord causes the oaks to whirl and strips the forest bare, and in his temple all say, Glory. The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord sits enthroned as king forever. May the Lord give strength to his people. May the Lord bless his people with peace.
Good, thank you. So diving in again, what sorts of repetitions do you see? And the most obvious ones are the ones to start with. I'm sure you're seeing, first of all, ascribe, ascribe, ascribe. That word in Hebrew is yahav, which means give, really, impute, or something like that. It's as simple as that kind of a word, but you've got ascribe, 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 with similar sorts of things to ascribe to the Lord in the first 3 lines there. And then the second half of verse 2 breaks that parallelism with a new verb, worship the Lord in holy splendor. But these are all imperatives delivered to the people. And then you really got the next part clearly marked off by the repetition of the voice of the Lord. All the way through that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times the voice of the Lord is the subject of the verbs.
And it's the
verses 3 to 9.
Speech act.
Right.
That God's
voice. Kol
the speech
Adonai,
act does
the voice, the sound, of God. It's not God doing this.
No,
it's the voice.
Which is a Genesis 1
Right.
again, right? He speaks creation into being.
Right. Absolutely. Yes, that's true in Genesis 1 that God says things and they emerge.
Yeah.
It's almost like God's describing what's already sort of emerging as the story goes along. So the voice of the Lord is the subject then for verses 3 to 9. All of that repeated and repeated and repeated. Lots of repetition in there. Some of it you can see it in English, like shakes, repeated twice in verse 8. But that word whirl in verse 9 is the same Hebrew word. So that's repeated 3 times. All of this language of shaking and disruption identified with the voice of God. And then you could either divide verses 10 and 11 into 2 small ending sections, or you might say that's the third and final part. But you've got repetition again. The Lord sits in verse 10. And then it goes to a kind of benediction to the people in verse 11. So already you see a structure there. Ascribe, 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 worship, imperatives, that's the first part, and then the voice, 7 times in only 7 verses, and then that last sort of piece. So what other kinds of repetition do you see? What other sorts of repetitions do you see when you're looking at that? I'm trying to read the comments as they go, but certainly water language.
Yeah, I have water is the cosmic disorientation, right? This whole cosmic images. You named all the repetitions I have down, but this is so reminiscent of Psalm 74. Right, 12 through 17. This similar. You could read those in parallel as well. That you are over the chaos.
Absolutely.
This is what you did, and then here is another description, another parallel description of God over the chaos.
God is over the chaos, and kind of God
creates the chaos. Yeah.
Flashes flames of fire, shakes the wilderness, shakes the wilderness again. Makes oaks spin and twirl and strips the forest bare. I mean, this is not
like hurricane
this
and
is
tornado.
Destructive language.
Yeah.
This is where we get that notion in our insurance policies about
acts of God,
right?
The unexplainable, powerful. Right.
Incredibly, God is a sort of a subject of an agency that is destructive, that is powerfully chaotic, and yet somehow this is a word of comfort for those who are reciting it. I wonder how that is. Maybe coming out of a situation of new orientation where you've been through the chaos, it's there, and you don't really think God is necessarily completely over against it. It's a sort of a different way of looking than at an orientation. Psalms of orientation tend to have God just, in control. Everything makes sense. Everything's orderly.
You wouldn't necessarily hear this
snapping timber and I don't know. It's just a thought.
Yeah, it seems descriptive of experience, the way we experience when chaos is in our life. It seems very descriptive, not so much prescriptive, that this is what God did, or in my I don't know, maybe I'm getting God off the hook in here, but it feels descriptive of my experience when I feel out of control and chaos is in my life, and there's no, it's all mystery. There's no sense of control, but it feels like, but the comfort is, but God is in control, and maybe that's just a proclamation of trust that God sits over even chaos, and this is what this looks like, or feels like. I don't know.
Yeah. A scholar of religion from the early 20th century, Rudolf Otto, talked about the way we humans encounter, natural chaos, the overpowering experiences of nature as a kind of religious experience. And what it elicits in us, he said, was a kind of encounter with a mystery, mysterium tremendum, a mystery that is terrifying and fascinating and compelling at the same time, and that what we feel in relation to that is something he called creatureliness, sort of our smallness within that, which can be terrifying, but also
powerful.
We're not in control.
Right. It's like tornado chasers and twisters.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, we lived in Florida for 5 years, and there was something you were drawn to and repelled by hurricanes. And when we had hurricane threats or hurricanes coming, there's something so powerful about a storm. Well, we know that too, even the other day, where you kind of want to go out into it and see it and feel it. So there's this mystery that, like Job says, you kind of are put into place, or you're put in the right place. There's a good question here from Rebecca, I think. If we want to, in verse 10, does the word sits, the Lord sits, mean continues to sit, or sits down after he has finished this? Does it represent a finishing of activity or continual sovereignty?
That's a great question.
Yeah, like we just got to sit down, or that's interesting.
Yeah, so I was looking at that. It's just the normal verb for sit, and the way the two lines are broken up, it's a little confusing exactly how one would want to translate it, but sits enthroned is a little bit of a free translation of it, because the more literal reading would be the Lord sits over the flood, the Lord sits, and there's no as, sits king forever. So it's much sparser in the Hebrew, but that is a normal word for sit or dwell in Hebrew. And the question, it's a good question about continuance or not, because whether it's a kind of a finite perfect verb or not, because verbs in Hebrew, I think, in my opinion anyway, can be read in a lot of different ways relative to English use of verbs. So you could maybe read it both ways. I have always read it as a kind of stative. This is the way God is.
Right.
God, and it relates to that notion that this is some kind of enthronement.
Right.
Ascribing
Presides.
to God as king, as ruler.
Yeah. Here's another question. Mary Jo asked, maybe I missed something, but God is creating the chaos here. Isn't God creating the chaos? The voice of the Lord? Yes.
I think so. I think this is, and maybe part of the problem is our idea of chaos. I used to teach a course on ecology and chaos, and we define chaos as the opposite of order, and we define order as the opposite of chaos. But there are ways of thinking of chaos as generative and not necessarily the opposite. We also sometimes identify order with creation, and then we identify order with God. So you get a kind of binary of God, order, creation on this side, and pandemonium, devils everywhere. That's another word for chaos. Chaos and
Pandemonium.
pandemonium, yeah, and anti-creation, the force, the monsters of Leviathan and so forth, as the opposite of creation on the other side. And yet, poems like this, I'm glad you brought this up. Poems like this suggest that God is identified with those forces, and part of those, it breaks up that binary that we often think in terms of God, order, devil, chaos, or something like that.
Right. Yeah, it's so interesting. There's this both and. That God is in the action, and yet is over it too, right? Dwells over it. Someone asked, in today's English version, the word, it uses rules. Is that, do you think she means for sits, rules, enthroned? The Lord sits.
And that would be a kind of an even more liberal translation of sits over, or however you want to read that preposition over there. I don't want to pull it up right now, is it sits over, or is it sits with, or is it sits in? It could be any of those things, or rules over, which is a kind of a strong, to my view, a strong arm translation, trying to kind of spin it in a way that feels more like that God of order.
Yeah, right. So it was maybe they didn't goof, but they made a translation. They made a choice in the word that they chose, which has an impact. Kind of back to our the idea of translation is an interpretive act. You are doing something when you choose a certain word. The translator does, because there's a variety there, and it has an effect and efficacy.
Absolutely right. And everyone should learn Hebrew is the other thing.
Yes,
to know
everyone should
that.
learn Hebrew.
At least a little, just so that you can kind of check out what the Hebrew behind something is. And if you aren't ready to do that, then commentaries can be really, really helpful. You can go and you can look at a good commentary, and that scholar writing the commentary will give you some information on the different possible ways of translating something, and also just comparing other translations, as you obviously are, by asking that question.
Yes. Jennifer has a good question, but I'm going to wait on it because we can probably do that toward the end.
Chaos is part of redemption, Shannon said. I think I agree with that, and I think that there is a creative potential in chaos. There is, new things emerge, new creations emerge out of chaos and on the edges of chaos. Chaos is generative, and even like in Genesis 1 and in some of these other poems in the Bible and from the ancient Near East, that notion of this kind of primordial chaos water that is there, the deep that is there at the beginning of creation, is a kind of womb-like, fecund sort of space from which life emerges and from which creation emerges in many mythologies, which again suggests that chaos, that kind of primordial watery chaos is the source of life and of death in some ways.
Right.
I had one more thought about the ascribe that might be a little provocative for us to think about. As we said, those are repeats, and you could translate that also just simply as give. Give to the Lord, O heavenly beings, you can translate as children of God, B'nai Elim, sons of God or children of God. At any rate, ascribe to the Lord heavenly beings, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Repeat it again, ascribe to the Lord the glory of his name. You could read this as what I would call effective language. That is to say, the worshiper is not just pointing out that God has glory and strength, but the worshiper is giving glory and strength to God. That the effect of this worship, it has an effect on God. It enthrones God. It glorifies God. It strengthens God. It glorifies God's name. The power of poetry, of language, and of ritual to create a reality. Rather than just saying, yes, we acknowledge you're glorious and you're strong and all of that, we're actually imputing you with that through our language. It's participatory.
Right. So then it says the people, or is it the people cry? Is that what you were just referring to? The people cry glory. Yes. The voice of the Lord causes the oaks to rut and the strips, and in his temple all say glory. So it is that affirmation and installation of who God is sitting on the throne and over this chaos.
And that word glory, which is another highly repeated word in this poem, is the Hebrew is kabod, which means weight or heavy. It's actually the word for, I forget what the heavy organ in the body is, when in the sacrificial directions on how you take apart an animal for sacrifice. Is it the liver or the kidney? I think it's the kidney is the heavy, but that's the kabod, whichever organ that is the heavy one. But that experience of glory, of kabod, is often the response to an encounter with God as a kind of overwhelming force of power.
So it's a mysterium again. It absolutely and what else can you do but
right? And it almost is like you're being sort of overwhelmed or by the weight, by the heaviness of it in some sense.
And I love this image again, back that it's like a throne room. It's a court in some way, and the people are watching and exclaiming, and then what else can they do but say glory?
Yeah, stupefied.
They're right, exactly. They are, holy cow, right? So then this new orientation. So is that how new orientation ends? Is almost this surprise of being overwhelmed with the power of God, the newness? That's
an interesting thought. I like that. It's not an ideological, or a doctrinal, this is what God is like, or, this is who God is. Now I know. It's sort of like overwhelmed.
Right. And there's such a, I think, in the new orientation, when new orientation comes to us in real life, after we are in disorientation, we can't make it happen. We can't move through disorientation on our own timeline, and there's no formula for it. But it comes to us. It seems that it comes to us in a new moment, in a surprise grace, and we are overwhelmed by the grace of new life. Surprised by joy, surprised by grace, I guess.
Someone mentioned the book about the Lament Psalms by Anne Weems, and that's a great book to check out. Wonderful writer.
Yes. There's another one. I don't remember the name of the author, but she translated in contemporary language all these psalms, and and this is probably from the 70s. I don't know, Marty Sutherland, you'd probably know. Psalms Now, I think is what it's called. Psalms Now, and they're pretty brilliantly done in new language, very moving, and so there are different translations of the Psalms that I think would be helpful for people. I
think we're just about there.
Yeah, we're almost there. Just a quick question. Jennifer said, and maybe we can do this offline. She said, "Is there a certain reason that or order to the Psalms? Were they put the canon of the Psalms put in a certain order for a reason? Do we know that?"
Yeah, there's some order to them, but and I don't know a lot about that whole discourse. There are lots of scholars who spend their careers trying to reconstruct how they were collected together and what that order is. There's some pattern, and there's concentration of certain kinds of psalms in certain places. There are these Asaph psalms, Maskil of Asaph as one of these two begins, that Asaph could have been a person. It also means to gather or collect, so it could have been a name for a collection. There's a lot of different, there are many different theories about that. There is some structure that's sort of obvious to it. They begin with hymns in the early part and end with those, but there are other, it doesn't look super obvious.
Yeah. Marty also said about the book by Anne Weems, she said it's interesting that the foreword was written by Walter Brueggemann, which is true, but they're friends. So Anne Weems and Walter and his family were friends with the Weems. So that is true.
Right. Well, we should maybe just wrap up. We're already
Well,
over
we're at
time.
50. Oh, I thought we were at 53 minutes. I think that's run slow.
Oh, okay.
No, we're at 59 minutes. You're right. Okay. And I don't know the author of Psalms now. And Marty, who is an educator, she was a Christian educator for 30 years or something, she said, wouldn't it be great to write our own Psalms of disorientation? And yes, do that, right? Take a Psalm of disorientation, one that we've given or other ones, and follow it along and write it in your own words, relevant to your life today or to the collective. Write a psalm for the people that we could use, and we would love to see them. So maybe post them. Another common response here is that we should do another class on the Psalms. Please do Psalms. Session 2. No?
Maybe. I don't know.
We've run
We'll
out.
see. Yeah, I don't have anything more to say, obviously.
Maybe we'll do a book. I don't know. Well, maybe a book. We know some stuff about Esther or something like that.
Right. Other texts.
Anyway, some other text, but maybe we'll do this again. Yeah. Thank you all for coming. This has been great, and it's been great to have you all, and it's been great to do it with you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Likewise.
Yay. It's been a good Saturday morning. Now I have to go write a sermon and work on that. Okay. Thanks, you all. Peace.
Great to be with you.
Yeah. Be well.
Thanks
Be
a
at
lot.
peace. May God give you strength to God's people. All right.
Amen.
Bye.